Hi, I'm Anastasia Pak and this is the RIP Labs podcast. Many discussions today revolve around AI and digital platforms, the advancements they bring, the privacy concerns they raise, their governance and their impact on society. The discourse has shifted from effective internet governance to digital governance, with much being placed under the umbrella term the internet. But is that a mistaken use of the term? What is the internet? And why is it not just our access to a search engine or our favorite social media platform? In this episode, my guest Hisham Ibrahim, RIP NCC's Chief Community Officer, breaks down the layers of the internet ecosystem, explains what a stable and resilient internet means, and clarifies the difference between digital governance and internet governance. Hisham brings both technical and policy expertise with over 15 years of experience in internet technology and governance. He recently published a series of articles exploring why the internet is not what many of us think it is. So, what is the internet then? Hi Hisham.
Hi,
Nice to see you in beautiful Lisbon, and I'm very glad we're finally doing this episode because I wanted to do a series, not a series, but an episode where we talk about the internet from scratch, kind of, because we cover very important and technical topics, but sometimes you're like, yeah, let's also know and understand what's the internet for those who are maybe not necessarily running the internet, but often hear about it or just go to the discussions and you have a series which is called The Internet is Not What You Think It Is.
Yes, I do.
And I hope you will uncover what then it is.
The internet has become a shorthand term for everything that touches the internet. Everything from the infrastructure to the application to the digital services to the communication services that are built on top of the internet. On a daily basis, people just use the term internet to describe that. Actually, at the beginning of the internet, you would find more people talking about the web and the internet. Those were more terms that were used, and cyber. Today, a lot of these words are used interchangeably because it has become part of how people describe everything that touches the internet. For the most part, that is fine in discussions. It becomes problematic when decision makers, policy makers try to make decisions that affect the technical coordination of the internet in an attempt to try to fix issues on, let's say, platforms or anything that is built on top of the internet. So providing that clarity is, in my opinion, was essential, and that's what sparked the articles.
Yeah, and so why then the internet is not the web, social media, or our favorite app?
I've been hearing this for years as well, that for many people, the internet is, well, their favorite app, whatever it is, their social media connections. That's what they consider to be the internet. The internet, what it really boils down to is transmitting packets from point A to point B. That is what it's really all about. And to be able to do that, it is built on two core principles. The first is open standards. So these are standards that are developed for the internet by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, that work on these protocol and frameworks of how different devices from different manufacturers can communicate with each other, right? And that provides interoperability. That means regardless of your underlying technology that you're building your network with versus the one that I'm building my network with, we can still communicate because we use the same open standards. The more vendors move into proprietary standards, that takes away that ability to have that interoperability, seamless interoperability that the internet provides and is dependent on. So that's one of the first core principles. The second being the registration of internet identifiers. So the way that the internet works, it's a machine, so it knows binary zeros and ones, and it uses them to address each other. So IP address is like, well, your physical address in the real world. And imagine the packets that are sent over the internet like envelopes. So on an envelope in the old postal system that a lot of younger generations now do not know or recognize, but when you would send out an envelope, You would write on it the sender's address, physical address, and the receiver's physical address. And the reason why you would do that is because, well, the postal service would know who to deliver it to, and in case they cannot find you, they need to deliver it back to the person that sent it. So this is the concept in the internet of IP addresses, right? You also have something called autonomous system numbers. These are numbers that recognize the different networks. But because we as human beings, we recognize names more than numbers, this is why DNS, for example, was invented, domain name system was invented. So registering who is using these IP addresses, these domains, these ASNs, these ports is important to how we are able to deliver these packets back and forth over the internet. These are the two principles that are essential. If you take them away, you take away one of the fundamental characteristics that's made the internet the success that it is today, which is permissionless innovation. The ability for anybody to be able to put their service online and be able to communicate because there's interoperability and reachability because of the registration services. And that's really what the internet is about.
I think in our line of work, we are reporting on internet events, for example. And when we talk about internet shutdowns, what's the difference between a shutdown of I cannot reach my website and there is a misconfiguration in the routing table? And because we are more, or the RIP NCC's world is more about the second one, but I think it's good to also explain what's the difference.
I can give you an example from my early years. I attended a conference, this was more than 15 years ago, and people started getting restless and uncomfortable. They couldn't reach their, favorite app, their mail clients and stuff. So I knew the technical engineer that was supporting the event. So I walk over to him and I ask him a question. And I say, is the internet working? And without lifting his head from his laptop, but he's like clearly hacking away, he goes, yes, of course the internet is working. What are you talking about? So then I ask another question and I say, well, is the network here working? So he glances at another screen and he goes, yep, Wi-Fi is up, 100 people connected, the network is working. But I could still see people, restless and not able to reach them. So then I asked the question, is our network connecting to the internet? So then he pauses, looks up to me, grins, and goes, now you're asking the right question. And the answer is no. A couple minutes later, we figured out what the issue was through troubleshooting, and then everybody was happy because the internet was working again, right? That's the user experience of it. And this is where it gets different for us as techies, because we need to do these troubleshootings. We need to deeply understand how every element works so that you can actually figure out what the issue is and isolate that and work on fixing that, rather than conflating the whole issue by saying, well, the internet is down.
So, and a very big part of this internet ecosystem that you explained now is played by the regional internet registries, including the RIP NCC. So what is the role of them in this system?
So I mentioned part of the core principles of the internet is the registration of internet identifiers. Now, there are 5 RIRs globally, each one that serves specific service region. And they collectively operate a joint internet registry of all the numbers that are being distributed. The role that they play is part of the technical coordination work that is a layer. So think of the internet as, layers. So at the core layer of that is the technical coordination work. And the RIRs are part of that work. IANA is part of that, and others. The work that the RIRs do supports the growth and the stability of the internet through a number of different things that they do. The first is, scalability, for example. While there was a lot of IPv4 prior to the global runout and the RIR runouts, they were making sure that they got distributed and allocated fairly based on the policies that were developed per region and met the different criteria that were there. Now, as IPv4 ran out, there's more push for IPv6 today because that's really what will provide that scalability and the internet to continue to grow and evolve. So being big supporters of IPv6 and promoters for it and the technology really helps with the underlying technology that all the other stuff, the digital stuff that gets built on top of it, needs. The second element that the RIRs provide is a very specific part of security. So cybersecurity is a big scope. The scope that the RIRs focus on is routing security. So making sure that you actually are the person that you are announcing on the internet that you claim to be, and you are the rightful holder of these resources that you say that you have. See, the internet at its core was built on trust, because the internet, it's not like somebody sat down 40 years ago and started drawing and saying, okay, in 40 years, we're going to have all these AI people, we're going to have all these activists online trying to do this, and how do we protect against that? It's actually something that evolved over time, which is something that needs to continue to be preserved. It's one of the most resilient systems that are out there. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning this in the context of routing security is because it initially was based on trust. That what reason would you have to claim that you are not who you are? Now, today, we know that there are more reasons, which is why we introduced something like RPKI that was developed at the IETF and is now each RIR has its own anchor, and they're working on issuing certifications for the rightful resource holders to be able to, for others to validate that they are the ones that they claim they are and they have the right to use those resources.
They are, you mean the network engineers or networks themselves? So who are we talking about?
So this is all on the network layer. This is where, again, techies live. So we techies like to call ourselves internet plumbers, and that's pretty much what it is. This is just making sure that, the plumbing works and it's healthy and that the system operates the way that it's expected to work. The third one is the resilience. So issuing something like autonomous system numbers, which I mentioned, which is like unique IDs for networks, for autonomous systems. This enables them to, the network operators of these systems, to do something called multi-homing, which is like buy from more than one upstream, so that way they have redundancy at that level, to be able to have more control over the policies of what goes into their network and what doesn't. By allowing to do that, you get more and more redundancy, which is very important in case any issues happen to your network, which happen frequently.
You've said in your article that the technical coordination keeps the internet running. We briefly discussed that internet governance shapes how we use it, and then digital governance steers how it transforms society. Can you unpack this layered model a little bit?
Internet techies call what we do plumbing. So think of the internet coordination as the plumbing of the internet, right? So if you're in a building, for example, there needs to be plumbing that actually works, right? Now, if you think of internet governance, it's more about how you do fire drills, for example, or how shared common spaces are used in your building, right? It's the sets of principles and norms that everybody considers to be, acceptable. In the internet world, this is an intersection between technical coordination, between human rights and policy, right? Now, when we go up to the digital governance bit, think of it as, well, now you're in your own apartment and you want to, furnish it or bring your own aesthetics or start installing smart devices that allow you to, close your curtains when you leave the apartment or, adjust the temperature and stuff, right? So these are stuff that you want to be doing to shape how you live in your house, in this example, right? The issue is that if you now start because you want to, make a bigger room, then you knock down a wall that is, a foundational wall. Right? Or that you affect the plumbing of the whole building by, bypassing a pipe or something, right? It's these things that would have deeper consequences that go beyond that, but this is my apartment and I can do what I need to be doing here, right? So aesthetics change and evolve over time. But really, if you end up making any fundamental cracks of how the building actually operates, in this example, it's the internet coordination of it, to fix an aesthetic issue, then you ruin the building for everyone, not just yourself. So decisions that you make, like how much water pressure that you want, could have consequences that need to be taken into consideration in the internet context because it's a global interoperable system.
And so what's the difference between internet governance and digital governance? And why do you think they are often so conflated?
Think of it as a layered onion, right? So where you have the technical coordination at the core of it, internet governance goes beyond that. As I mentioned, it touches on human rights, it touches on policy. So things like, content moderation, for example, and stuff like that is something that they've been discussing, human rights and how that affects.
So this is the internet governance.
That's more on the internet governance side of things. Digital is more now how you want to position yourself when it comes to stuff like AI, for example, which is a big thing people are discussing these days. Or the countries now come up with their digital agendas to try to position themselves in certain areas when it comes to technology, which makes sense. There are questions that need and require experts at all these layers to stop and pause and consider, because it is not an easy yes/no questions that get paused, because each one of these could have consequences on, like I said, either the internet or the society or how people operate. So the people involved are grappling indeed with complicated questions, and what works for your society might not work for my society. So the internet, since its inception, never really looked at borders, never really looked at society bits. All it really cared about was packets from point A to point B, whether point A and point B were in the same country or across the globe. But then when you start looking at the internet through a bordered lens, so digital agenda of my country is I want to be first in whatever, right? That kind of puts you at odds with the concept of, but this is a global system. And while it is understandable that governments and policymakers want to develop those digital policies and concepts because, well, they're looking after their societies, it still needs to come with a foundation of understanding the plumbing of the system. That way, like I said, you don't knock down a wall unintentionally that could have severe consequences on others, well, down the pipes from you, right?
Now the world is so complex. There is a lot of countries that are not in, let's say, friendly terms with each other. There is a lot of geopolitical turmoil going on. Things like, for example, misinformation and on the internet that people are discussing. And what is considered misinformation for one state, it's not for the other. And a lot of forums that talk about the internet governance, digital governance, all digital rights, etc., they talk about this and really push for sort of national ideological agenda. But you mentioned that the internet at its core is global. So how do we tackle this? It's probably a dilemma not one person can solve, but still, what's your view on that?
The issue, as you very rightfully said in your question, this is something that is on the internet, not in the internet itself. In the shorthand, people say, well, misinformation of, the internet or something. But it's really platforms that are built on top of the internet that are sharing this. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed at the platform layer. The problem becomes a problem when governments or others try to address this at the technical layer. So changing how DNS works or IP, for example, to fix an issue like for misinformation, which we have seen governments coming out and trying to do. It usually affects their internet in a much more negative way in the country, but also does not really solve the issue. And that's something that we've seen in many, many examples. The problem is also that it depends also on the country that's doing this, because there are different countries that have dependencies when it comes to the internet. So for example, there are countries that have large coasts that allow them to have submarine cables docking into their countries. But then you also have landlocked countries that then depend on the countries that do have those coasts, that do have those cables for their upstream providers to connect to the rest of the world. Now, if you make a decision as a country that has the cables coming in, you're not just affecting yourself anymore, you're affecting everybody downstream from you, which is the example of you knocking down a pipe. Well, then all your neighbors would still have an issue. And you cannot just claim that, well, it's my pipe and my apartment. So that's really where dealing with the issues at the right layer is really important. And this is why, well, I wrote the article in an attempt to clarify the different layers that this needs to be tackled at. And for policymakers and people that are working on these things now to realize that there's more at stake than just the problem that they are looking at through the lens that they're looking at. Because it could be an economical one, could be a society one, but you also need to look at it in a technical one. And this is where the role of the technical community comes in.
I think a lot of us think about the world within the borders. We maybe imagine this map that we saw in the classroom, but the internet, when we look at the map of the internet, it's a completely different story. Maybe sometimes some connections correspond to the country level, but most of the times it's not. And you already explained many examples, but can you maybe talk about the borderless internet and how to sort of convey this message that you cannot just say, you know, I want to shut down the internet in Lisbon and it's gonna just stop working.
You mentioned internet shutdowns, for example. There are ways of closing basically that connectivity within a network. And if that network is big enough or coordinated enough with other networks, then it takes down its downstreams and could have a national impact. One of the big, actually more than one of the big hyperscalers went down recently. So big cloud providers that have a lot of content on the internet. This is something that made headlines and people were talking about, and the news were talking about how the internet is down. The internet was not down. Again, like my previous example, the internet was working fine. It was that network that was unreachable due to technical issues. And I remember having a discussion with a colleague of mine talking about, well, should we do more research in this? And their answer from a technical perspective, and I understand it, was, but this is one ASN out of 70-something ASN, 70,000 something ASNs that, just had an issue. It's not a big internet event. Yeah. But as far as, well, society and end users were concerned, multiple things that they needed for their life were no longer reachable. And this is where in internet governance people start talking about stuff like, internet centralization. Yeah. But what they really mean is centralization of platforms on top of the internet, again, where the terminology now matters. When you look at it from, let's say, a government perspective on the data, for example, this is where the digital governance bit comes in place. It's like, where is the data stored? Who is the country that this company is registered under? And then you begin to look at it through an entirely different lens. But trying to address these, again, by trying to change how the internet works, because we call it all internet, is not the same thing. There's a lot of good people that put a lot of interesting and good work for over years in this, and I referenced some of them in the article. So, for example, there is the policy network on internet fragmentation, which I talk about a little bit. This is something that was developed under the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, that looked into all the different kind of user experience fragmentation, technical fragmentation, and governance fragmentation. There's also Internet Society that put out an impact assessment for policymakers to make them aware of, if you start introducing policy X, then this means it could have these effects on it to help with the checks and balances. Through ICANN also, there was the work that was done in human rights. So there's more and more of this work that is needed and essential because, as we discussed before, there are no easy answers to this, and especially when you talk on a global scale. It's easier if you talk on a city level or a country level, that you find people more homogeneous. Yeah. But really on a global level, these issues, when it comes to rights, when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to these things, are very different. But the internet needs to continue to be global and interoperable. So addressing those issues on the internet level could be problematic.
But why should we keep it global?
The internet success is the answer in itself, right? So before the internet, we had the telecom model, for example. Telecom model where you would have like the national incumbent, the big telecom, that would have all these agreements with all these different other national incumbents that had exactly, how much it's going to cost me to send you a call, how much it's going to cost you to send me a call. We would have dedicated lines between us, we would have contracts, and that's how it worked. The intelligence of the system was centralized. That's why they were called central offices. And that's how that model worked. Clearly, a more superior technology appeared, which was the internet. And the reason why I say it's clearly more superior is because today, rarely you find people using the old telephony system that used to be in place, SS7. What the internet provided was something different. The intelligence no longer was centralized. The intelligence was at the edges, which allowed, as the devices that we use get more and more advanced, the internet still does its thing. It just pushes packets back and forth, but your devices now are able to do more and more to meet the needs and your expectations. It also, by design and by choice, didn't have a billing mechanism for back and forth, because what ends up happening on the internet is you ask me, for example, for a file, and I send you the file, right?
Yeah.
So I'm actually sending you more information than you sent me, but it's based on your request. And there's been a lot of attempts before to try to put a billing model on top of BGP. It doesn't work with the internet. And this is where trying to project other concepts and other things of what we know and experience on how the internet grows and evolves have proven to be not useful. The bit that I keep on going back to when I talk about the internet, because it is one of the main characteristics that makes it as successful as it is that permissionless innovation. It's the fact that you can add more to it. So all the different hypes and jumps that we've seen in the internet evolution were because of, individuals, companies, or others that put something that disrupted how people did, communication or social media or different technologies or services and stuff, right? Which then made people invest more in connectivity, that made people want to get the services, that made them use more of the service, that meant more interest from regulatory side to enable this to happen. So what we've really found in the peering and interconnection world, for example, is that there's three elements that usually go hand in hand together: investments, infrastructure, and regulation, right? So if a country is actively trying to connect to the internet, the global internet, which goes to your question about globality, then they need to look into the regulation and make sure that they don't have too much red tape that prevents others to come into the market, deploy their devices, do their things, because that is something that is needed, that allows them to interconnect with the rest of the world. There needs to be the infrastructure in place that can support the increased demand that people will have as this comes in. And there needs to be investments in this, right? Who is paying to get those people connected, and how will that happen? So all these elements work together, and it has been proven time and time again that those that try to isolate from the internet are not the ones that end up succeeding. It's the ones that open up and try to do that global connectivity is really when things begin to change on a society level. And this is where it brings us back to, okay, but what kind of society are you trying to shape, which takes us to the digital governance.
But actually what you told now brought me back to actually this place, to RIPE 90, where we have here a lot of internet pioneers gathered together, people that didn't know, they were just experimenting with things, and it happened to be a service that can connect people from all over the world. And it feels that the communities like RIPE community, or I don't know, the other technical communities, ICANN, ITF, they are having very important discussions. But then we go to the fora like IGF or some policy fora, and there's just completely different understanding, completely different vision, and not completely different, but just it's kind of another world. And my personal impression that they're working in silos, but is it true, or maybe they don't really need to communicate? Or
so when you look at, you asked me earlier about like regional internet registry. So when you just talk about the registry function, that's the allocation of the IP addresses and how that gets managed and stuff. So that's like purely internet coordination side of things, right? But then policies, for example, that govern how this works are developed at meetings like the RIPE meeting that we're here now, as you mentioned. So this takes you a step into, well, the internet governance side of things, of the policies that shape how these things, these identifiers are registered and allocated and such, right? Now, at RIPE meetings, while there are people that come and present on society issues and rights issues and stuff like that, it is not the main focus of the meeting, which then takes you a step further into like the internet governance discussions, whether it's on a national level or a regional level or at the global level. So the RIPE NCC, for example, supports throughout its service region every NOG, network operator group, that asks for support, either financially or by sending speakers. But we do similar with the national IGFs as well and the regional IGFs as well, because we do believe that between the NOGs and the national and regional IGFs, it brings together people that discuss the broader concept of not just how the internet is coordinated, but what's on top of it and where it's going and what impacts they may have. To give a concrete example of this, policy was developed years ago about how to distribute the final /8 big block of IP addresses from a technical perspective at these meetings, right? Now, at the internet governance level of discussions of this, it was more about, but what about the developing countries? And while that was factored in the, okay, we should be mindful of giving smaller blocks moving forward, it's still something that keeps on coming up in the internet governance discussions about, well, what about the global south? What about countries that do not have the economy to be able to support certain things? So these discussions absolutely need to be happen and are interconnected. So while I am talking about it as an onion that has layers, they should not be operating in isolation, and they are not. They're all interdependent, and they actually bleed into each other. Like, it's very difficult to draw concrete lines around, well, this is only coordination and this is only governance. And like, it becomes blurry very quickly because, for example, take AI as an example, right? AI, you do have elements of it that touches the internet. And if it touches the internet, then yes, I can argue that this becomes an internet governance issue, right? There are some people that are looking into, maybe we need to design, I don't know, infrastructure a little bit differently. Not IP, not DNS, but the cables, for example, that need to do. So then you're talking at a different level. But then there's other elements that everybody's now talking about when it comes to AI, which is the, the policies and the governance and the
privacy,
ethics and stuff like that, which, unless it has a direct connection to internet, is not an internet governance issue. It becomes more of a digital governance issue, right? And I mentioned WISIS, the World Summit on Information Society, which 20 years ago looked into internet governance. Last year, there was the Global Digital Compact, the GDC, that governments participate in, that we're talking about how they are seeing digital basically evolving on a global level as well. So there are forums to do this, but this is where the participation of the technical community is really important. Talking with the governments, getting people from the technical community on the delegations that go to the UN meetings where they have these discussions is important, so that, again, to avoid unintentional consequences that could affect how the internet works.
I'm trying to challenge you in the conversation, but to be honest, when you said that, we engaged with the national governments and also the operators groups, I personally, in Central Asia, where I'm from, I really see the difference, and I really see how us sort of making engagements with both the operators and the governments makes a very, very big impact on the technological advancements of in this country. So it's it is possible that those groups talk together.
And that's a really good example because, well, Central Asia, take that as an example, right? Landlocked countries primarily, right? That rely on their neighbors for their upstreams, right? So that's already something that we touched on. And well, if the internet of their upstreams is affected by, I don't know, sanctions or by other stuff or by regulations they have imposed on their own internet, then that affects the downstream, right? So that's one element of it. But if you look at Central Asian countries, they've actually made an active decision of we want to be part of this global system. So they're not closing up on ourselves. We actually want to be connecting to this global internet thing. And this is where the three elements that I discussed, the regulation. So then the policymakers, as you're saying, are actively working with, well, the technical operators, the infrastructure providers, to be able to build this in an attempt to bring more investment. And as more investment comes in, then they invest more in the infrastructure, they relax the regulations. So it all kind of snowballs from there. And well, then you as a citizen, you feel the society difference from, when you were growing up to versus what you see today.
Yeah, that's very positive. It's nice to hear that.
Yeah, and we have a really good example with the CAPIF meeting that we do, the Central Asia Peering Forum there, that over the past, this is the 4th year that we're running it.
Yes, number 4.
And we've seen the big difference in the transformation that is happening there on a technical level, but also in terms of participation. We get participation from C-level executives from almost all the national incumbents from that region, because they do see and realize the importance and the essence of this. So you have technical people talking with policy people, talking with the C-level decision makers and operators, really trying to connect to the globality, versus what we're seeing in other parts of the service region or the world, where you're beginning to hear more about us versus everybody else, and let's close up on us, and let's just do it. Yes, and everything's sovereign, and like I said, while there are real issues that they're facing and tackling with, which is why they propose these ideas, but what we have seen over the course of the past 40 years of internet is that may not be the answer that you're looking for.
I still want to touch upon security, and since it's like an episode of debunking like misconceptions, could you maybe also discuss the difference between cybersecurity, internet security, and also then routing security that you have already mentioned?
The way that I look at things is cyber is this like all-encompassing everything that is in the I don't want to say digital, because I think digital is also a subset of it, but it's the all-encompassing element of the non-physical, let's say. When you start looking at the subset of that, which is digital, this is where you start looking into stuff like, our data, for example. How is that processed? Where is that being held? And how secure it is, privacy issues and stuff like that, right? When you start going a little bit less than that, then you have other elements of security that are still very fundamental and important. It could be everything from the physical security of the cables, for example, or the infrastructure that is in the ground. There used to be this thing that stopped with fiber, but because when operators were putting copper in the ground to connect, copper actually has a monetary value. And in many places, people used to dig up the copper in the ground and pull the cables out and go and sell that on the market. And that used to have a market value. Now, with the introduction of fiber, glass doesn't really have the same value as copper anymore. So I still hear these random stories here or there about how the connectivity was lost somewhere because people still think that there's copper in the ground that they can actually go and steal, while that's not really a thing. But making sure that that is secure is one thing. Securing everything from your data centers and your services and stuff like that, that's something that is also within security as well. The area that the RIRs really focus on is routing security, because BGP is built on trust, as I mentioned, right? Yep. So when it was first built, it was, what incentive would you have to try to advertise that you're somebody that you're not, right? Now, it was possible that you would have, what we call fat fingers, where you type in something that, by mistake, and that kind of leads to some confusion. But really, the system trusts at its core. what RPKI provided, which is a patchwork on top of other patchworks, on top of other patchworks, which makes the internet evolve and continue to work, is let's make sure that whether it's intentional or unintentional, that your advertisements are, I can validate them and make sure that you're not claiming to be able to take me somewhere where you cannot. Right? There's big examples of this. There's a lot of research and stuff that's put out there when it comes to RPKI and the reasoning why this was done. But really what it is that the RIRs now issue a digital certificate that validates that you are the rightful holder of the resources that you are advertising. And if you have that, then I can check that and go, okay, this makes sense. I will send you my traffic. So it's really at that traffic level. It is not the stuff that's on top. It has nothing to do with the data that's being sent. It has nothing to do with data centers, the applications, all that other stuff. That's other layers that have their own security. What we really focus on is just the routing security.
Is it like, for example, analogy, because we were talking about the post, if it's like a track and trace post?
It would be like the postal person going to you and saying, can you show me your ID, right? And just to make sure that you are the person that was supposed to be receiving this. Yes.
Yeah, much more secure. Well, I think we covered a lot of different topics, and but to close it nicely, I think we'll discuss complex layers, infrastructure, governance, protocols, security. But still, what's the biggest misconception that people have about the internet and how it works?
I'll mention two quick things. The first one is about that layered governance bit that we discussed a bit, because normal layman's people use the term internet for everything, and that's fine. It's similar to when we start talking about the air around us, right? Nobody really differentiates in a normal conversation of like the different spheres or the different elements in the air, because for us, air is air. Internet is internet, right? But as a specialist, you understand that there are different layers at different levels that have different characteristics that could be utilized in certain ways to bounce waves off of them, to get things done. So understanding that, if you are now beginning to look into the governance of this, then you need to understand those layers, right? So this is where the term air or internet is different from, well, if my kid says the internet is not working at home, different from if a government says the internet is not working. Other story that I could maybe end on is we usually hear about, people advertising saying, we will break the internet with, I don't know, photos or news or whatever it is. And it's became something that people use in a daily basis. I will break the internet, or this person claims to break the internet and stuff. And what they're really talking about is like crashing a server somewhere, right? Now, the funny story is that a few years back, a paparazzi actually tracked down Vince Cerf, who is one of the co-creators of TCP/IP, the IP, the technology that is used for the sending addressing. And that paparazzi stopped him on the street and asked him, what do you think about these, claims of so-and-so saying that they could break the internet? And Vince is a very nice and sweet person. He actually stopped and he tried to explain that the internet is a network of networks that has been running for years and years, and one person can take down the internet. Now, that's obviously not what the paparazzi wanted to hear, but that's the difference between, again, experts that actually understand that it's a system that has vulnerabilities and that needs to be addressed. RPKI was one that we discussed. Scalability, IPv6 is another one that we discussed. Redundancy is one that we also discussed. So there's stuff that we need to be doing there, but just claiming one person or one news item or one photo can break the internet, no.
That's good to know that it's resilient enough and strong enough to not care too much about some celebrity viral videos or things. So, well, thank you so much, Hisham. It was a very great discussion and pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for this. It was really nice talking with you as well, and nice to see you.